So, welcome. Can we really describe open source conceptually as a success? Probably most of you in here have benefited from using open source, building on top of it. A couple of faces I recognize have even built companies around it. I think for many definitions of success, it's very hard to point to open source as a concept and say it has not been a success. Did we really push the button, though, as the open source community? Have we really taken it as far as we could have done and, more importantly, should have done by now? In that sense, is open source a success? I'm going to be cheeky at this point and posit that it's not. As you're about to find out as we go forward, I care deeply about this subject matter. You have to accept that as someone who's standing here saying that I don't believe it's a success, this makes me deeply uncomfortable. I have built an entire career for myself around the subject matter. I'm hoping to be part of the solution as my career goes forward, and I hope to take you all with me. I think there's some systematic failings with the way we treat open source communities. We produce some amazing software, and it's not by luck. But we're producing amazing software in some very specific domains. And, to put it negatively, we are not producing amazing software in many domains. And I truly believe there's some systematic problems for that. For those of you who have never worked in a large-scale environment for technical systems, you might never have been through a post-mortem before. So I want to take a moment just to talk about what a post-mortem is. Especially in microservice environments, like complex environments with different systems talking to each other. When things go wrong, it's not always obvious why. And your team's usual retrospective is probably not the best environment for working out what went wrong, how it went wrong, how can we do this better in future. Typically, the best way to do this is to have a dedicated meeting for analyzing what went wrong and making sure that we don't do that again. Thank you very much. And typically, these get called post-mortem. Normally, these particularly happen because something quite dramatic happened. In the case of open source, I'm not about to suggest that something very dramatic has just happened and we need to deal with it. In fact, quite the opposite. I want to point out that I think there's been a systematic failing that we have either not noticed or we have turned a blind eye to for about 35 years. The good news is, for those of you who have been in post-mortem before, you know, there's a sort of industry-wide joke that it's like, you know, 5 engineers go in and only 4 come out. No one's getting fired today. But I apologize in advance. I intentionally am going to say some things that, if you care about open source, might make you uncomfortable. This is by design, and like I said at the top, these things make me uncomfortable, and my hope is that if you agree with me that these things are uncomfortable, you might also want to be part of the solution. I work for a company called Zalando. If you don't know what we do, we are Europe's largest e-commerce company. We're also just one of Europe's largest tech companies, full stop. We ship boxes of clothes. We have about 22, 23 million customers a year, and across Europe, we're like the go-to place for if you want to buy some shoes or a nice dress online. Day to day, I work in the search department. So when you go to Zalando and you search for red shoes, I work for the team that makes sure that you get red shoes, and not just any old red shoes, but the red shoes that you might actually have a chance of buying. That's what I do day to day. Open source by night. There's been an open source flavor to my work since forever, and I have been involved with many communities. I'll get back to that in a little moment. For now, however, let's talk a little bit about what what a post-mortem looks like, because some of you might not have been in one. I am going to start as a relentless self-promoter by talking about myself a little bit, because I figure it's important that you know a bit about me if I'm the guy who's about to make you very uncomfortable. Then we'll talk a little bit about what is the actual problem we're addressing here. What is this systematic failing that I think is happening? Maybe you don't agree that this is a systematic failing. Maybe you do. Maybe you don't agree with my wording. Maybe you do. But at least I want to make it clear what is the problem that I feel we need to address in this session. Once we understand what it is I'm talking about, then I'm going to talk a little bit about the timeline. When do I think this thing started? When did I personally become aware of it? And where are we now? What's happened since? And are we really addressing it? Then we talk a little bit about what's the impact, like because we perceive this problem, what has happened, and what actually caused it in the first place. And then to wrap up at the end, I'll talk a little bit about what we've learned along the way as part of the journey, and potentially start to talk about what solutions might look like. I appreciate this track is called Solutions Friday. I will warn you in advance, I'm not proposing any solutions in this talk whatsoever. But instead, I just want to make you aware of the problem and hopefully take you along on the journey of finding the solution. So a little bit about who this clown in front of you is. Like I said, I work at Zalando now. I've had a whole career working in engineering leadership, always with some form of open source context. Before that, as an academic, I did a PhD, which was all around open source. I contributed my first line of code when I was living in Scotland at the age of 16, so more than half of my life has been dedicated to this subject matter. And I've worked on lots of different projects, a variety of different projects, content management, desktop, groupware, database. I've pretty much walked all the way up and down the stack. And outside of technology, I do evangelism work as well. So I'm a fellow of the FSFE. I'm a member of KDEV, which is like the steering body for the KDE desktop. And I'm a fellow of Open Forum Academy, which is kind of like an industry body think tank around open source. I say this just to remind you that I do care. So before I start complaining and ask you to be better, I just want to admit I'm also part of the problem and I do care about the problem. The other thing, just as a warning, because as much as possible, I do want to treat this like a retrospective. So when we get to the questions at the end, I would appreciate if all of your questions are couched in terms of we. There is no I, there is no you. We have collectively failed and we collectively should be better. Yeah, please ride along with this. So, enough of that. Let's get to the actual problem. Open source, or even free software, as I originally remember it, has been around since the 80s. It's been around for a while now. We have produced amazing software. We have undeniably, as a community or as a set of communities, changed the world in a positive way. We're particularly good at making tools for engineers, right? You would be crazy to, if you're running your own DNS, you'd be crazy to not use bind, right? We're really good at building for each other. The domain where we're not so hot at is when we're not building software for engineers. I assume as I look around the room and I see a couple of heads nodding, there's always been this historic viewpoint that open source always triumphed when you didn't have to look at it. I see a few people laughing already. I fail to find this funny. This has always been true and it's still true now. There are a couple of classic examples of where we did get it right. And everyone, whenever I mention this, says things like, you know, look at Android, right? The world's most distributed operating system. You can look at a couple of other things as well, like you say, like look at Drupal, right? If you're trying to use a content management system, actually not just Drupal, but also Joomla, Plone, and a few others, you'd be crazy not to use the open source option. We don't get to work this way, right? You don't get to cherry pick the few successes and then say there's not a problem, right? Overall, in the volume of open source that's produced, if we if we ignore products for engineers and just look at everything else, there's enough There's enough lack of success that we do or really should ask ourselves, is there a systematic problem here? Is there something we're getting wrong? And the question that I really want to focus down on, I really want to drill into, because this is important when we think about building products, is open source community too, or I say here, unnecessarily focused on code? That is what I want to drill into, because this is what I posit is actually the fundamental problem. I'm also going to posit that we'll get to it. I'll posit things later on. So, timeline. Now you have an understanding of what it is I want to talk about and what I want to drill into. Let's talk a little bit about where this came from, and I'm going to argue, or I'm going to predict something I'm going to say later on, and predict or argue where I think the starting point was. And I'll talk a little bit on a personal level about how I first acknowledged the problem and where we are now. So, like I said, back in the dawn of time, there was free software, there was not open source. As a quick aside, I would just like to throw out there, if you're still the kind of person who thinks that open source and free software are not one and the same thing, please come to me for reconditioning afterwards. These are different viewpoints on the same thing, right? These are fundamentally still the same thing being spoken about. And back when it was free software, back in the late 80s, the definition of free software was posited in the form of 4 freedoms. And the nature of those 4 freedoms and how they were written is where I'm going to suggest this problem started. And that was back in February 1986. Since then, time has passed, open source thrived, we went on to produce some truly amazing software. By now, we're maybe at some kind of tipping point. I would argue by now, open source kind of is the default method for developing software, but only just. If you think about how software is actually developed in real terms, I would say the majority of it's still done in-house proprietary, and by that I mean it's never distributed at all. But otherwise, we're at this tipping point where I would say now it is basically the default method. In 2015, I was speaking on the topic of open source at the Write the Docs conference in Prague. And I was talking about the involvement of tech writers in open source. And if you ever have the misfortune to go to YouTube and see the recording of that talk, about 5 minutes before the end, you will see the moment where I realized that what I was about to say was fundamentally wrong. And I went totally off script. I was looking people in the eyes, and I realized that what I'm about to say to you is totally wrong. Now, that realization and what I was about to say versus what I did say is not important. What is important was I realized that something was wrong here because I made an assumption as an engineer about how a tech writer feels about open source. And now, years later, a couple of years later, I'm now standing here talking to you about what I realized then, what I have heard since, and what I would like you to also take away. This is the best example of it. I have had numerous actual conversations. This is just a tweet, but I've had numerous conversations with people, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, various platforms, about how dismissive open source can be of non-code contributions. It happens all the time. And the thing I want to really draw attention to here is look at what this person said. They did not name check some specific project. They levied a complaint against open source as a whole. Right? They did not cherry pick something. I don't know which individual projects they may or may not have been, actually not been involved with, but they have levied their complaint against open source as a whole. Again, I'm seeing enough nodding going on in the room that I suspect there's some non-coders in here who have probably been made to feel the same by the open source community. The next stage in our evaluation of this problem is to work out what the impact of all of this is. Like, what is the result of being too focused on code rather than other things within inside the open source world? And the first thing we would normally look at is the customer impact. Now, in the world of open source, that's kind of like a foreign concept. We tend to be more focused, or we should be more focused on user than the idea of a customer. That's not to say that of course, there's plenty of businesses that make a living out of open source, and of course, they do care about customers, but at a community level, fundamentally, what we care about is users, right? The freedom zero is couched in the terms of users, right? You are free to use the software for any purpose. So normally as a business, if you're doing a post-mortem, you think about customers, but for today's conversation, let's talk about users. Adoption of open source outside of engineering tools is not great. I've said it before, and I'm going to remind you of this numerous times before we all leave the room. I am welcome. If you want to challenge me on this afterwards, please do. But I am going to keep telling you this is a fundamental problem. Yes, there are exceptions, but this is the customer impact. We make amazing tools for engineers. We have a few cases of where we have succeeded elsewhere. But in general, the elsewhere is where we truly suck. And it is systematic. How do we know that we are not succeeding in these places is this very notion of we inherently know that we succeed where open source does not get seen. Right? We know this. It's this feeling that everyone has, sometimes people want to talk about. This is the customer impact that no one wants to talk about. Business impact. This is a really foreign concept in terms of open source community. But the question here effectively is the problem that we have created somehow harming ourselves? Right, so beyond the impact on the user, what does it mean for us? Here's where we get lucky. I think if you ask the average person what their view on open source is, in the grand scheme of negativity to positivity, I think people by and large see open source as a fundamentally good thing. I'm not going to say everyone is super, super happy about it, but I think by and large people see open source as a positive thing and certainly has the potential to be a really positive thing. So we've kind of struck it lucky here. Again, I mean, if you have a different viewpoint, I'd love to hear it, but I think by and large the viewpoint of open source is pretty good. So we've managed to get through, and again, I think it's largely because we have been doing good work. We have been producing great tools. People don't think negatively of us. At least my personal viewpoint is I'm at least willing to admit that we can do better. Give ourselves a 6 out of 10. No one really complains internally, right? The problem here is whilst we continue to make amazing software, while we continue to make this journey towards being the default method for developing software, we stop to have moments like this very infrequently. We're so focused on what we're good at and what we're successful at, largely because of a historic, argument about why open source or free software is better than proprietary. We're so focused on what we're so good at and why what we do is so important, we very rarely take these opportunities to actually admit what we're bad at. As a result of that, when you don't do that retrospective, when you don't do that post-mortem and are honest about it, this is when you miss out on some important fundamental failings. This is where you miss out on your opportunity to realize, you know what, actually, we're really not so good at that. Okay. So we've done a little bit of exploration of the problem, looked a little bit about what the effect of this is. Let's talk now about what caused it. In many organizations, the way to do your root cause analysis is to start asking yourself why. Why does this happen? And then when you have an answer to that, you ask, why does that happen? And so on and so forth until you get to a point where you're like, I can't be bothered asking why anymore. The magic number is usually 5. For the sake of brevity, I've only got 3 questions today. So my starting point is, why are we so unnecessarily focused on code? This is a supremely open-ended question. There are dozens of answers to this question. Everything up to and including, shut up, Paul, you're wrong. But I'm going to throw out there as one potential answer, as one very specific thing, because the entire ecosystem is totally dominated by coders. Now, when you think about how software development works in any context, yes, there is always more coders than anyone else. That is different from being dominated by coders, right? Culturally, I chose this word for a reason, right? Yes, there are always more. If you think about the companies you work for and how many developers do the development bit, right? There are, your team probably has 5 developers for every product specialist, right? You have 5 developers for every people leader. You have 5 developers or 6 developers for every user experience expert, right? The industry as a whole is developer heavy, necessarily. And actually, if you look at your organization as a whole, especially if you sell a product, the developers actually turn out to be in the minority, because for every developer, you've probably got 3 salespeople. But inside the tech part of your business, yeah, you have lots of developers. In open source, not only do you have lots of developers, but they also dominate the ecosystem, and this is a completely different thing. How did this happen? Why is the ecosystem dominated by coders? Again, open-ended question. There's lots of answers to that, including shut up, Paul, you're wrong. The one I'm going to throw out here is because we're not very good at welcoming anyone else. Coders come, coders code, come do your coding thing, please, welcome. I would even go as far to say as we're actually pretty good at being somewhat diverse on the coding scale. We have an undeniable problem with recruiting women. We have an undeniable problem recruiting people of color. In fact, if you're not a white, beardy, fat man, right, you're not part of the cool club. At least open source is pretty good at diversity in terms of skill level. It's always been very good at bringing junior people in and giving them experience. So it's not like it's an entire, it's not like it's an entire fail. But in general, if you don't work in code, you're not necessarily all that welcome here. Thank you very much. Harks back to the tweet I showed you earlier. Why? Why are we convinced that we don't need people? How did we come to this mindset that the code is all we really care about, all we really need to focus on? I'm only halfway through, but I'm going to tell you the punchline to my whole talk right now. It's because we misunderstood how the system was started in the first place. And by the system, I mean free software, or open source, or whatever you want to call it. That is why we don't really value contribution beyond code. And I hope in 5 slides' time, when I show you how this happens, there's going to be this collective kind of like, oh, I see what you did there. Because even this passed me by for a very long time. So what are the lessons we've learned along the way? So between realizing that there was a problem and between starting to want to fix it now, you kind of have to learn some things along the way, right? And this helps you understand what can we do better. These are normally couched in terms of understanding what did we do wrong, in amongst all of this, what did we actually get right, and perhaps, where did we get lucky? What went wrong? Systems fail. When you see a system fail, and here I'm not talking about a social system, I'm not talking about a technical system, I'm talking about a social construct. Systems tend to fail because they were either designed badly or they were designed well but then set off on the wrong track. Not even necessarily implemented badly. You could just take a good system and point it in the wrong direction. I'm going to argue just now that actually the system was badly defined. What I am going to say, and I'm going to show you how, is even if you want to say that the system was well designed, it was very, very badly interpreted. And we should all collectively be ashamed. And when I realized that my own interpretation was bad, I was deeply ashamed because I had this bias as well. Before I go on to the next slide, I'm going to say in advance what the bias is. As someone who cares deeply about free software, I always ran with this feeling that freedom and free software were couched in terms of code. If the 4 freedoms had been couched in terms of code, it would be very easy to point at the origin of the system and say, there's the failing. And when I first started thinking about this topic, as someone who cares and thought he understood a thing or two, I told people that, there's your problem. The whole thing is defined in terms of code, and that implies it includes all sorts of biases inherently. Here's the 4 freedoms. Freedom 0, the freedom to run the program for any purpose. Phenomenal. Easy to understand, lacks ambiguity, no problems here. Freedom number 1, the freedom to study how the program works and to change it to make it do what you wish. We can come back to this one. Freedom 2, the freedom to redistribute and make copies so that you can help your neighbor. I'm going to lump this together with freedom 0. It's a fundamentally good thing and it's well defined, and I think the intent is pretty clear. And finally, freedom 3. The freedom to improve the program and release your improvements and modified versions in general to the public so that the whole community benefits. It's in bold because I'm lumping it with freedom 1. When you look at freedom 1 and freedom 3, it is very, very easy to confuse yourself into thinking that these are talking about code contribution. And that is collectively what free software and open source has done since forever. That is the fundamental understanding breakdown that as a community we have made since day one. Nowhere in these freedoms does it mention code, and yet we treat it religiously as if it does. Very explicitly it says, at freedom 1, you have the right to study how it works and to make it do what you wish. That is not necessarily a coding task. That can be a design task. That can be a user experience task. That can be documentation. This can be anything about making the program better, and yet we always interpreted this as you have the right to alter the code. Fail. Let's look at freedom 3. You can improve it, and you can release your improvements. It's exactly the same thing. I can improve a program by writing better documentation. I can improve a program by putting better marketing on top of it. I can improve a program by helping out with user experience. I do not have to write a line of code. And yet for 30-odd years, that's exactly how we have treated freedom 1 and freedom 3. This fundamental failing is how we collectively as a community have let ourselves down. It's not all crap. We did some things very well. We did change the world for the better. We did create some incredible software. We did not just create incredible software, but software where you would be totally bonkers to choose absolutely anything else, right? There are so many domains in which free software and open source have really kicked ass that I'm not even going to go into it now. You know what they are. We just didn't push the button. Right? We just didn't take it further. Right? We didn't get beyond engineering products. Where did we get lucky? Well, like I said earlier on, I think the thing where we really, really got lucky is in perception. People do, despite our problems, despite infighting, despite our inability to produce certain types of product, despite a lack of friendliness in certain quarters, the world does perceive open source as a positive thing, and it should. And this is good, but we have to admit now we got lucky. If enough people with great skills come along to open source, if enough people send out that tweet saying, I'm a user experience expert and I was made to feel deeply unwelcome. I'm a woman, I was made to feel deeply unwelcome. I'm a person of color and I was made to feel deeply unwelcome. That is wholly unsustainable and is a tarnish on your personal brand or our community's brand that we would never ever get away from. There's no coming back from that. The fact that we have not got that far is something where we undeniably, we got lucky. So, resolution. As I said at the very top, my mission here today was to make everyone aware of the problem and to a certain extent make everyone feel a little bit uncomfortable. There are smarter people than me in the world. I hope some of you are in the room who can help me work out what the solution is. Intuitively, instinctively, I would like to look back at definitions like the free software, the 4 freedoms, the 10 facets of open source, and a few other things, and say, like, is it now time to reword these? Is it time to make them less ambiguous and more welcoming? A naive assumption that might work. Hopefully someone way smarter than I am is out there and maybe watching the video afterwards and will come to me and say, here's a better approach. But it's definitely time to do something. I hope, having been through this today, that everyone in the room at least takes some time to think about what the solution might be and how you can be part of it. Because ultimately, as an open source community, as a concept, no matter which project you might be involved with, ultimately all we're trying to do is make great software that people can benefit from. And I think as long as we always remember that freedom 0, you have the freedom to use the software for any purpose, as long as we remember that means we have to create software, excellent software, for any purpose that can be used for that purpose. Please join me in the journey. Thank you very much.